Hello everyone, Valiath here, and today I'll be showing you my plus 24 Blackrook haul that I did with a group from my guild. We had some mistakes along the way, but overall this was a pretty solid run. This video will include fast forwards and skips to shorten the length of the video, but I've also uploaded the full, mostly unedited run with no commentary as well. You can find a link in the description of that video, or you can click above. The majority of tanks opt to go to the right here, as the mini-boss at the end is slightly easier to deal with. There's no difference in trash mechanics, but the left side does have a slightly higher enemy percentage. The ghostly retainers need to be stunned, knocked up, or any way possible prevented from casting Soul Blade as much as the group can. This cast is not interruptible. The debuff needs to be dispelled as soon as possible, as it does a significant amount of damage, and what's worse, it stacks. If you have more than 2 out on your party, it really starts to ramp up in damage. Unless you're a priest, of course, that can mass dispel it. The ghostly protectors cast Sacrifice Soul, which reduces the damage taken by other enemies around him, while also making himself take more damage. It is important this guy gets killed first. Also pay attention to the ghostly counselor's Soul Blast cast. This should be interrupted as much as possible, as it does do quite a bit of damage. At the end of this tunnel sits a mini-boss. If you went to the right, you'll face Lady Velandra's Ravencrest, which is what you see here. The number one thing you and your group needs to do here is stay spread out, so you don't get cleaved by her glaive toss. This hurts like hell, especially on fortified weeks. The tank will get hit with Strike Down, which does a lot of damage by itself, but also puts a debuff on the tank, making him take 20% more physical damage. You may need to pay extra attention to the tank during this fight, especially if they're not using their mitigation properly. Now to the first boss, Amulet of Souls. This is a pretty easy fight to heal, as there are not that many things that actually hurt so long as people don't stand in bad stuff. The swirling scythe he throws out will probably one-shot people on higher tyrannical weeks, which is not something we can do anything about if people stand in front of it. He will continue to put out soul echoes on people, which is the big swirly circles that spawn at your feet. You want to make sure you take this to the side of the room and away from the group. The boss cycles through these spells until he reaches 50%, when he goes into the middle and spawns 7 ghost ladies for us to kill. Do as much damage to these ghosts yourself as well, and help with any stuns and knockbacks you have. They cannot be allowed to reach the boss, because if they do, each one of them makes the boss's Soul Burst spell 30% stronger. Soul Burst does a lot of damage, so make sure you save your AoE damage reduction spells or other abilities that can quickly deal with a lot of group damage. Next up is this staircase, with all the spiderlings and eventually the big mama spider. Each and every auto attack from the spiderlings will put a nasty stacking debuff on the tank, which does a lot of damage if left unattended. You'll see here that our DPS was a bit impatient and grabbed aggro from the spiderlings, which put some stacks on them, which they eventually died from. Good tip for DPS players out there in the staircase: make sure you let your tank get aggro before you go full Zug Zug, as there are only so many dispels healers have, and we will always prioritize the tank over you. This next room can be quite dangerous, as most people seem to ignore the Risen Scouts' Knife Dance cast. This does a ton of damage to the group, and will kill people as you see happening here. The scout needs to be stunned or otherwise disturbed to prevent this cast to avoid the damage. This is even more important on fortified weeks, where if this goes off on high enough keys, it will either wipe the group or severely damage everyone. Outside of this, make sure the Arcanist cast is interrupted, don't stand in front of the champion, and make sure you get out of the way when the Archer does his frontal AoE shooty thing. Also stay a bit spread out, because the Risen Champion leaves a nasty bleed on people. The next 4 trash packs are basically the same enemies, just in different amounts. Keep an eye out for allies that like to stay out of line of sight when you go hide behind the pillar. Way too many times I've found people out of line of sight and they're just running around in circles almost to spite me on purpose.
Summeral Dart.
Next up is the second boss in the dungeon, Ilisana Ravencrust. This is a two-faced fight which has some rather dangerous abilities we need to pay extra attention to. The first is Brutal Glaive, which targets a player and does damage on impact, as well as puts a nasty dot on them. Make sure you know who is getting hit with it so you can focus healing them quickly. Unfortunately for me here, the boss targeted our lowest geared player in the group multiple times, which made it a little tougher. Vengeful shears a frontal on the tank, but should not be much trouble for all tanks to mitigate themselves. Dark Rush targets 3 players, and when cast, the boss will charge towards them, leaving dark green stuff on the ground that persists for a long time. The players will want to all be on the same side of the room, to limit where and how much of this green stuff is in the room. In stage 2, which lasts for 45 seconds, the boss will target a player with eye beams, which does no damage to the player itself so long as they continuously move out of the beam. Once he is done with this, it goes back to phase 1 again, and she goes back and forth between phases until she's dead. This next area is perhaps my favorite one in here, just because of the sheer amount of enemy density and the insane pulls you can do in here. A significant amount of enemies here have the light blue nameplate, which signifies they have dangerous frontals. These scavengers are not particularly dangerous until they successfully cast Ancient Potion, which makes them do one of 3 abilities that do hurt. Success in here depends a lot on your tank, and his ability to position these guys in such a way for the group to avoid all the damage that will go out. Group stuns and other ways to disrupt casts is a premium in here as well. Once everyone hopefully survives the staircase, we have reached the Gauntlet, another area that I find quite fun as it allows me to do a lot of damage while spot healing as needed. Just make sure the Dominators are interrupted, and if you're fixated, either run away or pop a defensive. Your tank should set the pace for moving up the staircase, but generally do not engage more than 2 Dominators, as they will start hurting. Once at the top, it's time for the 3rd boss in here, Smash Spite the Hateful. This guy is quite dangerous as he has a multitude of very damaging abilities that we need to be prepared for. The first one, Hateful Gaze. It targets a player and the boss rushes towards them. Any player can stand in its way to intercept this charge, which is what most people opt to do. Once hit, it does a lot of upfront damage, but it also leaves a debuff on the player, making them take 500% more damage of any future Hateful Gaze until the debuff expires. You will need a 3-person order, which normally starts with the tank, then 2 of the DPS, preferably melee players. After the 3rd one goes out, the debuff on the tank should have dropped off and he can intercept the 4th one. Earth-Shaking Stomp does a ton of group damage, and you will need to make sure everyone is fully topped off before it goes off. It goes off once every 25 seconds, so plan your seedings accordingly. Fell Vomit puts a green laser beam on a player, which indicates that one of the bats flying above will shoot down permanent green stuff on the ground. It is generally a good idea to try to aim this at the edge of the room to allow for as much open space as possible. That is the entire fight. It's relatively easy from a mechanic standpoint, but very punishing if we as healers are unprepared for the Earth-Shaking Stomp. Once he is dead, we start making our way to the last boss. During the way we will encounter risen swordsmen and lancers. The swordsmen target your tank with coup de grace, which does a lot of damage to your tank. Pay attention to them here, especially if you're pulling several of them at once. Pro tip here, when you mass stun a large amount of enemies like we're doing here, it completely resets their melee attack timers, meaning all of them at the same time will hit your tank with melee attacks. With large enough packs, that can hurt a lot. The lancers cast Raven's Dive, which is the big grayish circle on the ground. Step out of it or you'll be stunned. Note, the circles are bigger than the visual effects show, so make sure you give yourself some extra room, which I neglected to do. Now it's time for the last boss in here, which is also a 2-stage fight. The first stage does do some good amount of damage to players, so be prepared for that. You can see here we are getting hit pretty hard continuously throughout this stage. Also make sure that if you're targeted with the glaive, you try to aim it to the shortest distance to the wall if you can. Other than that, just make sure you don't get hit by the glaive, which does a ton of damage if you stand in front of it. The beginning of stage 2 is where the danger level really spikes up. The first Shadow Bolt volley he casts does a ridiculous amount of damage to the group, and you'll need to make sure you have all your big spells available for this. Everyone will need to use their defensives as well. We popped everything here, which resulted in the cast doing very little damage to the group overall. After this cast goes off, we get a buff that gives us 300% of practically everything, which makes the subsequent Shadow Bolt volleys much more manageable to deal with. The last spell in this phase that is dangerous is Stinging Swarm, which targets a player and does a lot of damage to them. You will need to focus heal this player immediately and hope that your DPS kills the swarm, which is the only way to remove the effect. This boss gets intense the longer the fight goes. You want to make sure you cycle your CDs so you have something available at all times during this phase. That is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider liking the video, leaving a comment below, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.